Hi, I'm Dave Wallace, and you are listening to the Audio Description Narrators of America Know Your Narrator series, Beyond Your Narrator episode. Today we have Justin Sohl with us. He is the lead audio description writer at Deluxe. Thanks for joining us, Justin.
It's my pleasure. Great to be with you.
Yeah. Could you share a little more about your experience with audio description?
Yes, I started in audio description in 2002. I started with the Media Access Group at WGBH, and I was a scriber for many years and then post-production supervisor. And then in 2012, I left WGBH with several of my colleagues there, Anna Capizera, Matthew Warren Lane, and Matthew Christofferson. And we started our own AD company called Hollywood Access Services. And so we did that for a couple of years until that eventually closed down. And then I started doing freelance audio description work with Deluxe and became full-time with them in 2015. Yeah. So I think about 5 years, yeah.
With all those years of experience, you've had different perspectives on the audio description experience and also the process, it sounds like.
Yes, it's been interesting working with a couple of different companies with different sort of workflows, plus my own company where we sort of came up with our own workflow. And so I've enjoyed getting to see different aspects of how audio description can be produced.
Are there a lot of consistencies or differences that you can think of off the top of your head?
Well, when I first started at WGBH, here's one example: is that it was kind of common practice that anytime we had a film in, it was sort of all hands on deck. We would sort of split it up. I'll take a reel because even today films come in reels. It's sort of a legacy thing. Back in 2002, film was still primarily being distributed on film to theaters. So the technology they had was a disc that would sync up with reel by reel. So we would sort of split up the films, and it was a collaborative process, and we would try to be consistent in what we called characters or locations or props, and try to keep track of when, what reel a character was named in, because one of the conventions of audio description is that we try not to give any information to the blind consumer that's not there for the sighted viewer, or try to reveal information at the same time. So generally we wouldn't typically name a character until that character is named in the film. So that would be an example. So that was a unique way of working. It had its advantages in that you could kind of talk through with your collaborators on, hey, do you have any idea how you describe this? Or, it was more of a collaborative process. The downside of that is that it was a lot easier for inconsistencies to come through. It was a lot easier to miss, say, the mob goon in the background in Reel 2 that gets described, actually has a more prominent role in Reel 5, and we kind of miss that. So that is towards the end of my time with WGBH, because at that time I was doing the scheduling. And then through now at Deluxe, it's moved more towards one writer per film if time allows. And so, I mentioned the advantages, obviously, with multiple collaborators are different eyeballs, and it's more of a collaborative process. But I kind of like the idea of a film being one writer's project and responsibility, and there's a consistency of voice throughout in terms of how you describe that piece of entertainment.
And it sounds like even with the different companies that you've founded and worked with, there's an overall evolution of audio description, either with technology or with other aspects. Can you talk a little bit about that, and as you've had a pulse in different experiences?
Well, with WGBH, most of our work was broadcast television, which is a different beast than anything else, because for a lot of the shows, like I described CSI or NCIS or The Simpsons. So, for instance, a lot of those CBS shows, we would describe off of a rough version and then not get the final until day of air, and it would come on a tape. And so the tape would be delivered to our post-production facility, and we'd have to go there, record it live to the tape, and sometimes there'd be changes and you have to describe it on the fly, and then deliver that tape to CBS, which is going to upload by satellite for air that night. And so your deadline, you're a matter of hours. And sometimes if there was a problem with the tape, or say the narrator called in sick that day and we had to scramble to find out the narrator, it was expensive for CBS to have to delay their satellite upload. So it was definitely a frantic situation. I think now with the post-production schedules, especially because most of the work I do now with streaming, you're not up against quite a tight deadline because they're packaging an entire season being produced at once. So there is a little more leisure in terms of being able to spend more time and get it right. So that's an encouraging thing. I'm curious because I haven't really worked on broadcast television work in a while. I don't know if those post schedules have changed or not, but I know that was very frantic. The odd thing is on the film side, it's almost been the reverse in terms of tightening the window of time that you have the material. And that's largely a security issue because digital files, there's much more of a fear of piracy when you're working with digital files as opposed to when you would work with film reels, which back in the day were beta tapes or 3/4 inch tapes that were harder to reproduce. So I understand the distributors and content providers are obviously concerned about security with their projects. So a lot of times the window has tightened. So whereas we might have gotten a movie back when I worked with WGBH months in advance of its release, now it might be tightened to a month before the release.
It's a lot of variables there. Either the system of how it's sent to you, or the technology changes, or maybe even the awareness of the companies that are hiring you of the process. Do you find that audio description requires X, Y, and Z to be produced in a way that creates the best being more than just a box to check? That this isn't just something that's, we'll throw it out to this company and then get it back. That there's a sense of, we want to make sure that we, the company that's hiring you, are giving you enough time to create your audio description content in a way that brings the best.
Well, I feel like I've been very fortunate in terms of working in audio description because I've worked with two companies and plus obviously my own company. The two companies who are sort of at the vanguard of actually caring about the quality, because there are a lot of sort of fly-by-night companies. A lot of them were captioning companies or sometimes the companies that were used to cranking out content. And then when this FCC mandate went into effect in 2012, mandating that a certain amount of broadcast and cable television provides audio description, and this is why actually we founded Hollywood Access Services when we did, to try to take advantage of some of that work. But because we were assuming at the time that the content providers were going to want to go with people who were experienced and knew how to make good product. What ended up is they went a lot of times with companies who threw together audio description departments and were really thinking of it from a captioning mindset of like, what's the bare minimum we can do to qualify, have words being recorded with a voice and thrown in on top of the soundtrack, and that meets the requirement. So it was kind of churning out a quick buck for a lot of companies. When I started with WGBH, it was a very slow process. WGBH they're a Boston PBS and NPR provider, so they're a nonprofit. They're not. Primary motive is not to make a ton of money. Their version of audio description was largely developed with the National Center for Accessible Media, which is a division within WGBH, which really worked on the technology. And they had a lot of funding from grants from the U.S. Department of Education around the time I started. a lot of the work we did at the time was like Turner Classic Movies, and WGH would release their own VHS home video versions, which you could, with a mail order catalog, you could order that were, the audio description was mixed in, on the videotape. And so those were not tight deadlines. It was like, say, for Turner Classic Movies, we had a big bundle package, like here's 20 titles and you have a year to do them, And so it was a great opportunity to take the time and learn the craft. And there wasn't such a tight deadline of you have to crank this out and just get it out the door. It was, I'll write the script, and they would have their position of post-production supervisor would edit the script. They would give us notes. It was almost like a publishing house or working at a newspaper. You get the editor's notes in pencil and input them and maybe have a discussion. It's like, no, I intentionally described it this way because of this. And it was a great place to learn at the time. Now, I know times have sort of changed even with the media access group. By the time I had left, it was an interesting place because when I started, most of the operations of WGBH sort of subsidized the audio description aspect, or what they call descriptive video service. By the time I left, it was the reverse. It was a downturn. It was the Great Recession, and suddenly all of their funding dropped out. Their endowments had lost a ton of value, and they needed certain divisions that could subsidize their PBS work. And so actually the media access group, actually descriptive video service, I think, was their most profitable division, and it was subsidizing other aspects. But the downside of that was we did have to crank out work much faster, had to take on as much work as we could. So fast forward to Deluxe, when I started there, they were really just starting to ramp up their audio description department. Hollywood Access Services had just folded. And so it was serendipitous that they started with one of my business partners, Anna Capizera, and then myself. We were hired early on to sort of help nurture their audio description department. And then third partner, Matthew Christopherson, came aboard. And so I felt like they valued our experience as audio description writers and valued our input in sort of developing style there at Deluxe.
You mentioned earlier about the craft of audio description. Can you talk specifically about your writing craft or in audio description crafting in general?
Mm-hmm. It's evolved a little over the years. There was a set of guidelines that WGBH heads come up with early on, I believe in the 90s, with a lot of focus groups of individuals from the blind community and accessibility experts in terms of what would be sort of guidelines for how to go forward. For instance, you wouldn't typically break the fourth wall. You wouldn't talk about camera movements in terms of anything that would be outside of your experience of the movie, because as the sighted viewer, when you're watching a movie, you're not seeing the camera, so that sort of takes you out of it. So things like that, things like writing in an active voice versus a passive voice. So example, you would say he walks down the street rather than he is walking down the street, just because it sounds better, which is also a trick of, journalism and just good writing in general. Certain things like if you have the option between going with a color or a tactile description, go with a tactile description. Because, while most blind or visually impaired individuals have had some degree of sight, there are obviously some individuals who've been congenitally blind since birth and don't have as much of a concept of color as texture, obviously. So if you had a choice between, say, in a cream-colored suit or a linen suit, it's much better to go with a linen suit because that's a tactile description. So certain guidelines like that. Where I think it's evolved a little bit is, and I listened to one of your earlier podcasts with Chris Flowers who talked about the same thing of you kind of have to learn the rules before you can break them. So once you learn the rules and understand the ideas behind why those rules were sort of set in place, then you understand situations where, okay, here's an instance where maybe I would talk in a passive voice when you're cutting to a new scene where somebody's in the middle of an action or something like that. It's an effective way using the passive voice saying, he is sewing a shirt. You get the idea that you're dropping in on the middle of him doing this rather than him starting the process, picking up the needle and thread. So that's a little instance where you might break the rule. Camera movements. The interesting thing audio description is you could say it's almost like turning a movie into a radio play, but movies are inherently visual experiences. And a lot of the great movies, the technique is part of what makes them great. And so you want to capture a little of that. So for instance, something that's popping into mind is like that scene in Goodfellas where you track with Ray Liotta as he's bringing his date through the back of the nightclub, and you get to see all the people, and it's one long shot, and all the people along the way. So you might want to capture that in some way. For me, maybe I would write a long sort of compound sentence to get that all this detail is sort of happening one after the other, and there's no break in how you're seeing it. So those are aspects, I think, from experience that have sort of evolved with my technique.
And with those details that you give, that creativity comes out. And like you said, doing a compound sentence for a one shot, that's a way to nudge the audience in a way without taking them out of the immersive experience.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I come from it I actually went to film school. So I come from it from, I think, a sort of filmic perspective. So yeah, a lot of times I'm looking at it like, how do I convey the experience? Not just the bare bones details, but the actual experience the same way that the sighted viewer looks at it. You know, another example I was fortunate enough, the only Hitchcock film I've gotten to do is Psycho. And there's that famous shower scene. I mean, you could describe what's happening bare bones, that curtains pulled back and there's a killer with a knife who stabs Janet Leigh in the shower. But that doesn't convey the experience. The experience is what's famous about it. It's a bunch of fast cuts of quick images. And there's details like the fact that you always see the knife plunging down. You never see it pulling back. You never see the knife actually break skin or anything. There's just action and reaction. And so when I describe that, I tried to describe it. First, I just kept repeating every now and then the knife plunging down, because that's what you're seeing. It's always coming down. And typically, another thing in rule of audio description, we typically would describe in full sentences. We don't describe in fragments in a way that a screenplay typically is written in sentence fragments. We try to make it more, almost again, journalistic in terms of a full, writing in full grammatical sentences when possible. Here's an example where I didn't, because it's so it's more fragmentary than your typical movie scene. So here's an example where I did just describe in image fragments to try to convey the experience again.
Can we talk about what you love about audio description?
I love the idea of it, of a cultural inclusivity that's trying to bring a large group of people into the cultural conversation. And I love the idea, especially with things like the theatrical experience, that a blind or visually impaired individual can go to the same movie screening as, say, sighted friends and family, and all experience the movie at once. And the friends and family don't necessarily have to listen to the audio description because there's the headset that the blind individual can use. But at the end, when the movie's over, they can all talk about it because they've all had the same experience. I like that aspect of being an equalizer for everybody gets to experience the shared cultural experience. Movies are both art and entertainment. And same with television and streaming. And so, it's great that everybody gets to join in on that experience.
Where would you like audio description to go in your dream world?
Well, the encouraging thing is that it seems to be expanding more and more every year. I think every year there's probably more films and series and back catalog content that's described than there was the year before. So that's a great development. What I would like to see is an emphasis on quality. I think it can sometimes get lost when you're looking at quantity. When I first started, the fight was just to get something described. not every big studio did it back in 2002. It was only a handful of studios that did it, and only really CBS that was willing to pay without a mandate to describe a good chunk of their content. So the fight then was just quantity, just have something that the blind consumer can choose from to watch. Now I would like to see an emphasis on quality, because like I said, there are a lot of those sort of fly-by-night companies that, because there's this work out there, will do it just to meet the bare bones requirement of what constitutes audio description. Like I said, a voice on, mixed in with a soundtrack. And part of that is price is a driver. It is an expensive thing. And I think a lot of content providers look at it like captioning and want it to be about the same cost as captioning. And there's a lot more expense in audio description. It takes a lot longer for a writer to audio describe a movie than it takes a caption writer to caption the dialogue. Plus you have to have a narrator, which that's another thing. I hope that audio description stays with live narrators, at least, in the near future, rather than going the route of a computerized voice. Because I think it's an organic human experience. So, and I think, and I hope they also go with quality narrators too. But there's that expense of the narrator, and if you want it mixed well, you need an audio engineer, an experienced audio engineer who can mix it well. So it's a much longer process, which makes it a much costlier process. I would like to see the content providers value the quality. Another thing I would like to see, hopefully, is that writers actually get credit, audio description. Fortunately, Netflix, I'm seeing more and more writers get credited on Netflix, and I hope it becomes standard. It's a shame when the narrator doesn't get credit either, but fortunately, at least on most of the work I've done, at least there's been a credit for the narrator, which is great, because there are fans of individual narrators like yourself, Roy.
I'd love to echo what you say about the writing credit, is that as any narrator, she can be associated with the writing. That, you're making a very clear distinction that the narrator and the writer, it's the term describer seems very generalized in the context of what we're talking about today, in that it is such a team effort. By giving the credit to the writer, it allows our audience to distinguish, oh, this is the kind of writing that I like, that a narrator could read, let's call you Shakespeare, and it's like, to associate that with you makes a difference. Yeah.
The other funny thing is that I've worked on so much content, so many episodes of shows over the years, that they kind of blur one to another. And I'm having a hard time figuring out which episode of The Simpsons did I write in 2005, which one of CSI did I do? And I remember working on this Harry Potter film, but did I write it or did I edit it? So it starts to blur. So even just for my edification, I'd like, it'd be great if I could look back and listen and be like, oh, that's right. I was one of the writers on that project.
Is there anything else you'd like to share with our audience?
Just that I think it's great now. Also, what I didn't have back in the early days is the interaction with the fans of audio description. You and I believe, first corresponded on this Facebook group, or first found out about each other in this Facebook group. That's been great for me to read comments from people who regularly use and experience audio description in terms of what people like and don't like. So yes, I hope that the feedback continues to grow.
How can we reach you on either social media, whether it's that group or otherwise?
Right. Well, yes, I am on the audio description discussion group on Facebook. That's a great way to reach me. Or I'm on LinkedIn, so feel free to link in with me.
Oh, thanks so much for all of this, Justin. This is great.
Thank you, Roy. It's been my pleasure.